Alrighty guys, hello and welcome back to the show. So, for those of y'all that have been watching the channel for a while, you may have seen this video I did on how to build for T3 Air in the air slot a while back. Now that video didn't perform super well. I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe I got it entirely wrong. I'm not 100% sure. But a lot of good positive feedback came out of the video in the comments. So if you haven't seen it and are struggling with Tech 3 Air, go check that out. But in that video, I mentioned that I don't really do strat rushes because I'm not good at them. And the build is slightly different to do a strat air rush. And I quite honestly, I've never had the time or patience to sit down and figure it out. Enter Stuxnet. He's been a good buddy of mine for a while on FAF. He's a much better player than I am. And he likes to do the strat rush whenever he's in an air position. So he put together a detailed guide on how to do it. And Stux, if you're watching this, buddy, I'm sorry this took so long for me to get out. He initially reached out to me like 3-4 months ago, something like that. And I'm just now getting around to it. I've been traveling a lot for work. So thank you so much for your patience. But today we're going to see if a shit for brains player like me can follow his instructions. And I'm also going to make a couple tweaks to his build. And I'm going to assume that there are less resources available. Like say you got some super greedy land players that just don't understand that you actually need mass in an air position. And we're going to see how that adjusts your overall time to get a strat out. And if you find that this video is tickling your fancy and helps you out even a little bit, do the whole YouTube ritual, like, like the video, subscribe, face north, spit in a sprinkler pattern, and make sure you only eat brisket for a week, because Texas. Okay, so before we get into kind of the recordings of me attempting to get into Stux's build, I wanted to highlight the primary differences between the build order that he gave me and what I highlight in my tutorial on how to build Tech 3 Air. So again, if you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check that out. I'm going to be highlighting the differences here. But first is the number of Tech 2 P-gens that he builds. In the build order and tutorial that I put together, it was 2 Tech 2 P-gens. I also used 5 additional Tech 1 Tech 1 P-gens, whereas he prescribes 8 Tech 1 P-gens and 3 Tech 2 P-gens with a reclaim order of the Tech 1 P-gens in the middle of upgrading to Tech 3. I leave my Tech 1 P-gens up until I get a Tech 3 P-gen online, and then, assuming I remember, go back and reclaim the Tech 1 P-gens. So that's one difference. The second is he builds 5 energy storages right after the upgrade of 5 mexes to T2. I usually try and work in 1 to 2 energy storages in my build, but I don't religiously do that in any of my games. If you pull any of my replays, especially recently over the last month or so, I don't think I ever build energy storage, which is bad for me. But I think in my tutorial I mentioned building at least 1 or 2 energy storages, but he goes for 5. And the third difference is he has a Tech 1 transport in his build order after upgrading to Tech 2 for reclaim. So this would be to go and get initial engineers that are sent out on reclaim missions and move them to the front line for additional reclaim. I didn't really include that in this particular build order because I'm testing this in kind of a vacuum. And so the only reclaim on this map that was available was a lot of wrecks that were in the center, and I felt like that was mostly for the land players. So I did build the transport as part of the build order, but I did not really include that kind of reclaim in my build order. So hopefully that makes sense. I think the results speak for themselves because ultimately whenever you're talking about testing results, you need to be testing like for like, which I did. None of the builds that I tested really had any reclaim outside of just the couple of trees and things like that that were immediately outside the base. But if you're going to be following this build order in this guide, make sure you use that Tech 1 transport. And lastly, believe it or not, probably the biggest difference is that he only puts 1 engineer on building the hydro with comm assistance instead of 2 engineers. He sends the second engineer out to build additional mexes and reclaim. Now, some people might like this strategy. I'm not a huge fan of this. because this might seem super small and insignificant, but in my experience, if you build 4 mexes with your commander and only send 1 engineer to build the hydro with commander assistance, this means that you're going to stall on energy. Now, it's probably very dependent on the proximity of the hydrocarbon power plant site to your base. Closer means you might be able to get away with it. Further means that it's going to be much sketchier. You might energy stall. But from my perspective, this means that you get less mass immediately. So only building 3 mass extractors with your commander instead of 4, and then sending only 1 engineer to the hydro instead of the first 2 means that you're going to be gathering less mass earlier. Hopefully that makes sense. Which can limit your potential scaling later in the game, because in my experience, the more mass you get faster, the more mass you're able to reinvest in your economy. And to borrow a quote from the movie Gladiator, brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity. Now, getting into the testing. I ran through my first run, and Stux is claiming that I can get Tech 3 by 8 minutes and 20 seconds, which is faster than I have, I think, ever done. And I was at 10 minutes right on the nose. So like anything else, this is going to take a little practice if you're following this build guide, and something for y'all to keep in mind as you're trying to follow any guide or any advice that you get from any Forged Alliance Forever player is that you want to actually practice the build order, maybe once or twice in kind of a vacuum before you try and go into it in a game, or you can just raw dog it and go straight into a game. That's fine. But with 3 or 4 attempts from me, the best I could get it down to was 9:30 for a Tech 3 upgrade and about 10 minutes and 30 seconds to get a strat out. Now, while this is well above what Stux claimed in his instructions, I think this might be because this map is basically barren of reclaim besides the stuff that was in the middle. And like I talked about a little bit earlier, I don't think the air player would normally be dropping for that. So because there was no reclaim, I think this is about what the best that we're going to do. But I would say that's pretty respectable for a strat rush, I think, and way better than I've ever been able to do in the past, anytime I've ever tried rushing a strat. So now let's adjust our resources, and let's assume that you only get 7 mexes instead of the 10 that Stux put in his build order. By the way, I'll redesign the way that Stux sent his entire build order, and I'll put it in a Google Doc. I'll link it down in the description below. Yell at me in the comments if I forget. But you can actually see kind of the whole step and plan on how to actually execute this build order in that doc, because I'm going to be referencing it multiple times in this video, as I already have. But let's assume that instead of 10 mexes, you only get 7. How badly does this affect the build order? And should you even go for a strat rush if you get to that point? And it turns out this doesn't really mess with it all that much. I was able to get a strat out in about 12-ish minutes, which, if you're assuming that the enemy air player is under a similar bind with only 7 mexes, that means that you're still in a decent perspective, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this can be directly tied to the lower mass cost of a strat versus a Tech 3 P-Gen and the e-storage to actually assist. So it's all about redirecting the mass that you're collecting to different places and how you're actually going to take that mass and spend it. But the most important thing to keep in mind, in my opinion, is that in this method on the same map, so I did an A/B test where I took Stux's build order, executed it to the best of my abilities to get a strat out. My strat was out at about 10 minutes and 30 seconds. Whenever I took my build order from the Tech 3 Air tutorial and used it to make ASF, which is the first thing that I do whenever I go for Tech 3 Air, I was only able to make ASF at about 13 and a half minutes into the game, which gives the strat that's coming out 1 to 2 minutes of airtime before an ASF that comes out of my particular build order. So if we take a step back, figure 30 seconds for the strat to get across the map, and then you have about a minute to pick off a comm, kill some mexes, level the opposing air player's power grid, suicide over flak, whatever floats your boat with you. If you want to throw your strat away, go throw your strat away. But if the opposing air player is following a build order like mine or similar, then you get some good money shots and you can really impede opponents' progress in that particular scenario by getting that strat out. So we know that you can get a strat out faster. Minute to a minute and a half before somebody using my build order can get an ASF out. Is it worth it? And this is where we get to the subjective part of the video where I talk about what I think. Now, everything in life and in this game has an opportunity cost. And if you don't know what that means, it's essentially what you lose by choosing to spend resources on something. Now, the easiest example is that right now, as I am recording this video, I am unable to play Starfield, which I have been playing quite a bit of over the last 3 weeks or so, because I am making this video for you. The cost is my ability to play Starfield, and the resource is my time. Now, side note, this is a really good metric to use in a lot of finite resources in life, like money, time, love, etc. If you use this, you can reprioritize a lot in your life outside of FAP by evaluating the choices you're making, what the opportunity cost is of them, if there are better ways to use that resource, and what the ramifications of using said resource are in a specific way, and how that will impact your life in the future. It's something to think about, but that's a side note. Going back to FAF, using Stux's strategy has pluses and drawbacks. So let's look at the big pluses first. The biggest one is if you use your strat to neuter your opponent air player's power grid, you send them back to the Stone Age. If you level their Tech 2 power and force them to rebuild Tech 2 power in order to even get to Tech 3, if they're in the middle of that Tech 3 upgrade, that is a massive win. And that can turn a 13-minute air grid into a 20-minute air grid, leaving their allies vulnerable for longer for your strats or whatever you cook up in the future. Now, you can also take this and level enemy mexes with mass storage, meaning that they've wasted mass on a crucial infrastructure upgrade. This can give your frontline players potentially an advantage on the front line. And lastly, you can snipe an enemy commander. And if it's a high value player, or if it's a full share, or if full share is not on, rather, this can be very rough to recover from. If you're in a 4v4, full share isn't on, you eliminate one of the players from the game. That is a huge power vacuum that one of your frontline players can then abuse in the future. Now, like I said, there are big pluses, but there are also drawbacks to this strategy. Now, the first drawback is you've invested a lot of mass into lower level tech that might not benefit you as much in the future. This looks like additional Tech 2 power generators. So there's one additional T2P gen instead of, so you're building 3 instead of 2, like in my build order. You're also building more energy storage, and you're only upgrading 5 mexes to Tech 2 because you're funneling that mass into other building projects, where in the build that I showcased in my tutorial, I had a couple of more upgraded to Tech 2 before I started actually building my Tech 3 power generator. Now, this means that if you're unsuccessful in your early raid, you can be put in a position of perpetual catch up, which is a bad feeling for any air player. I've been there many, many, many times, and it sucks. Now, whenever we bring this back, this is why scouting is super important, is because it can tell you by sending these scouts out, and Stux accommodates for a lot of scouts in his build order. Scouting can actually tell you if going for a Tech 3 or if going for a strat rush is actually going to pay off for you, or if it's going to be a liability that you're going to have to be paying back with interest throughout the entirety of the game by losing air fights and having to sacrifice ASF to kill gunships, etc. But this is why scouting is super important. If you're ahead of the enemy air player, if you're really ahead of the enemy air player, this is going to be gangbusters. Or if you're at least pacing even with them, you can oftentimes eke out a pretty good strat time with this build, and then be able to level their power grid before they can actually respond. So scouting, it's very, very important. I talk about it all the time in my videos. For whatever reason, I don't do it in my actual games. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm gonna stop pontificating. Ultimately, this should be another tool in your arsenal, not a one-size-fits-all approach, in my opinion. Now, as a follow-up video, I'd really like to get Stux on to critique this video and give some additional thoughts, because he does this a lot more than I do. I'm ultimately just following this guide. So Stux, buddy, if you're out there, I'm really sorry that this took so long to make and get up on my channel, but I did it. And I'd really like to put some time together over the next month or so to sit down, have a chat. We can record it if you're okay with that. See what I did right in this video, what I did wrong. And of course, all you lovely people, feel free to let me know what I did right. Let me know what I did wrong down in the comments below. I know you all aren't shy. And believe it or not, these comments are they're actually very helpful for reevaluating the way that I do these science videos going forward. So with that, I'll leave y'all. And thank you all so much for watching, liking, and subscribing to the video or the channel. And that's about it for me. Peace.